everyone. This is Dominic Kaylee coming to you from downtown Los Angeles in my apartment here. I'm really excited to be on this Close Encounters series today. I am presenting a piece that is really a recent discovery, but still quite near and dear to my heart. Last time I spoke about the composer Erwin Schulhoff. This would have been about 2-3 weeks ago. And continuing this discussion and performance study, we'll be taking a look at one of his true masterpieces for the solo piano, the Suite Number 3 for the left hand alone. That's right, I'll be playing with only one hand today, this piece by Schulhoff. And you'll quickly see why this music, first of all, is so beautiful and so revelatory, but also you'll see just how involved and really precise Schulhoff is in how he writes for the left hand. It's almost like a lot of times it feels like you don't even need the right hand to help at all because it really fits the left hand altogether. Sometimes when composers write music for the left hand, you sometimes feel tempted to use the right hand to help out a bit, but like I just said, in this case, Schulhoff writes so well for one hand that you never really have this urge. And also, for the listener, I know when I first heard this piece, I could have sworn two hands were playing. So, needless to say, the drama and musicality of this piece is quite stunning, and I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you. So, before I perform this piece, I would just like to say a few words about it. It's his third suite. He wrote this piece in 1926, and it's in 5 different movements. I can't actually necessarily mark each movement for you as I'm performing, but the movement titles are, the first is Preludio, which is prelude. So in other words, the first movement is sort of this opening where we, I guess the curtain kind of parts and we see a rather impressionistic landscape of beauty as the piano, with these 16th notes, it kind of slithers this way and that, creating beautiful harmonies that certainly would have been inspired partly by one of his early teachers, Claude Debussy. The second movement is a meditative piece entitled Air. This harkens back to a Baroque time, a time in the 1700s and the 1600s when composers were writing this particular dance suite called Air. And again, this slow, meditative, rather somber movement is really poignant for me and is always touching whenever I play it. The third movement is the exact opposite. It's a really rustic, robust zingara. This is basically a movement that really harks upon Hungarian music, folk music. Schulhoff was a Czech composer, but he was influenced greatly by other composers such as Bartók and Janáček, who were Hungarians and really employed this festive, gypsy-like party and music all throughout their repertoire. And Schulhoff dives into this world every once in a while with great effect, I must add. So I hope you enjoyed that movement. Until, again, with a rather sharp right turn, we go to the fourth movement entitled Improvisation. This movement is perhaps the most experimental of the 5 movements. You really enter into this kind of music that has no space and no time. It's just kind of floating there as though we have no gravity anymore. But Schulhoff, as good a composer as he is, he does have secret patterns that underlie this movement throughout. So even though it might seem like it's seemingly aleatoric, random, there's actually many impulses that he imbues into the music, and particularly at the end, that are sort of looking both at the movements that came before and the movement that's about to follow. The 5th movement is entitled Finale, and notably he writes molto maestoso, so which means very majestic. This finale is very majestic. However, he then is a little bit contradictory, or at least ambiguous, because then he writes allegro. Now, a lot of times when we think of majestic things, we think of these slow moving gargantuan objects that are just present and quite proud in their existence. But this movement both has a majestic and grandeur to it, but also a dance-like quickness and lithe motion. So I find these two markings to be quite interesting. A fast, majestic movement. It's something to ponder, certainly, but it employs wonderful rhythm throughout that you can just absolutely imagine someone dancing to, and it ends the suite in a really exciting fashion. So I think, first of all, I'll perform the piece for you, and then I'll start talking a bit more about Schulhoff and about this really spectacular piece, and personally one of my favorite works that Schulhoff wrote for the piano. So without further ado, I'm going to perform Schulhoff's Suite number 3 for the left hand alone.
Erwin Schulhoff's Suite Number 3 for the piano solo, but for the left hand solo. So again, after right now my left hand definitely needs a little bit of a breather after all of that, I would say. Um, it's it's a it's a piece that I only actually really discovered in the past few months, basically back in early autumn. And for me at least, when I first heard it, um, which is on YouTube on some recording um, by a wonderful pianist named Carolyn Weicker, um, I was immediately captivated by this music because I was hearing so many unique flavors of harmony, melody, rhythm, and all of these kind of, it's such an eclectic suite in my opinion, because it almost feels like we're going from almost the present, which is the Preludio, which feels like a present um, early 20th century impressionistic type time. Then we go back in time in the second movement to a Baroque era. Then we go again to the present in the folk music, the third movement. Then we go to the future in the improvisation with this incredibly forward-thinking writing. And then I would say that, again, with this finale, I've always thought of it as both a dance, but also as you see it, as the music unfolds, I think you may agree that it sort of transforms into a diabolical, psychotic march, some kind of ominous, it almost feels like an army is like approaching. The music starts in a rather
Oh, I am sorry. I just realized that I had not turned my microphone back on. That's right in front of me. I was talking for 1 minute with the microphones that I am using for the piano. I apologize. I'll backtrack just 30 seconds. Let me just make sure. Yep. I'm trying something a little different today to try and separate the piano sound from the street noise outside of my apartment. So that's why when I'm playing the piano and performing, I'm trying to isolate the piano sound best I can so that you don't hear, again, the noisy traffic of this bustling Los Angeles city. So in any case, what I had just briefly said before I turned this microphone back on was that, again, this piece, this Suite Number 3, was a work that I discovered only this past autumn. And I was listening to recordings on YouTube and came across it, and I was really attracted by how eclectic of a suite this is. It's, again, 5 movements, but it feels like in these 5 movements we are jumping around in time, in literally the Western civilization of time, where the first movement feels like we're very much in like a present day, for Schulhoff, present day, which is this impressionistic, beautiful style that was very indicative of the early 20th century in music making in Europe. And then the second movement, the air, we really go back in time to the Baroque era, the 1700s. And then the third movement, the Zingara, we kind of return once again to this wonderful folk dance and festivity. Until the fourth movement, the improvisation, we go into the future, I feel like, with this really exploratory, it feels like you're in outer space almost with the way the music develops and sort of coalesces into your imagination. And then for me, the final movement kind of returns once again to the present day, which is Europe at the time. In the he wrote this piece in 1926. So in the 20s, he had experienced World War I, and combining the horrors of war with his own fascination and love for jazz and dance, I see that this kind of combination of the two, the horror of war and jazz, dance, combined in this last movement, where the beginning, it comes off at first like a very, maybe perhaps very fun dance. It kind of feels like a wonderful flourish, and we might get something fun, but then, and then these dissonances start getting a little of these dissonances that are not as pleasing to the ear as perhaps the opening was. And by the ending, when we get all of these these really crazy lines and contours of music, not to mention him writing triple fortissimo. Yes. Oh yeah. Sorry, I was just reading a comment. The sound looks like it's better now. Okay. But like I was saying, the ending of this finale, for me, it turns from this charming dance into a psychotic, sort of horrific march of some kind. It becomes even more like stamping feet, pounding instead of light flourishes like the opening. So this transformation is startling, and I would say there's a little bit of frustration that we feel in the music as the distances keep on persisting over and over again. Schulhoff tries to find some sense of tonality as in the ending. He's trying to find somewhere to go, but then he devolves into just cacophony in some ways. Or we have no sense of where we are, which we had a wonderful sense in the previous movements where there was we have a wonderful sense of centering here, but Schulhoff is really pulling off the wheels of this car that's going downhill at breakneck speed. So it's certainly a wild ride, I would say. But to get a little bit more into the music, I wanted to take a look at each movement and just kind of share some of my thoughts. First of all, let's see here. Okay, first of all, the first movement, the preludio. It's actually really interesting that Schulhoff chose to call this a suite. A suite means a collection of pieces, and this was really made famous by composers such as Bach, Telemann, Handel. But Bach was the king of writing suites. And sure enough, Bach was writing dance suites. If any of you had listened to my previous lecture a few weeks ago on Schulhoff, I talked about how Schulhoff was obsessed and captivated by the music of dance, the music of his time. He was writing foxtrots, he was writing one-steps, he was writing all kinds of different dances that he and his friends danced in their nightlife. But he loved jazz and dance music. So it's kind of fitting that he takes the idea of the suite from Bach. Bach was, of course, writing Baroque dance forms, not contemporary dance forms, because Bach was living in the late 1600s to early 1700s. So, but Schulhoff, who was born in 1894, died in 1942. He was right at the turn of the century, and it was the golden age of the 1920s, where people love to dance and love to be exposed to big band music, jazz, and all of the above. But what's interesting to note is that Schulhoff, in his young years, he was influenced by many composers. Again, the great Czech composer Dvorak was one of his inspirations. Well, at least a composer that really saw talent in Schulhoff and pushed him to pursue music. But in his early years, Schulhoff was really influenced by the music of Debussy. Claude Debussy is one of the all-time greatest composers for the piano, one of the greatest French composers, and his music really exemplifies Impressionism. So similar to how you look at a Monet painting and think the lines are blurred and the artwork is wonderfully diffuse. It's similar in the sense of harmony, where in music, when we enter this preludio, which again is a bit inspired by Debussy. We have these wonderful shades of color that are gently lapping like water up against our ears. So it's a bit different from perhaps a more conventional, Beethoven. harmony is a bit more structured in some ways, and it's not as languid, I would say, as the music of Debussy in general, or, well, of Schulhoff in this particular case. So what's really important to note is just, first of all, how wonderfully Schulhoff's able to make you forget that I'm using one hand. For example, one thing that I sometimes get asked is, so what does the music look like when it's written for one hand, left hand alone? It doesn't actually look any different than normal piano music. I'll let you see it right now. So right here we see two different excerpts from the suite. We see the first page of the suite, and then we see part of the finale, somewhere in the middle of the final movement. And as you can see, this looks like a typical piano score, treble clef, bass clef. And in fact, he's using both staves, the treble clef on top and the bass clef on bottom. He's using both staves quite extensively, particularly in the second example on the right, where, if you didn't know any better, you'd be using both hands, I would say, because it looks like you're supposed to use both hands. So, but again, this opening, as you can see, even just visually speaking, it has a wonderful just shape to it. It's very graceful. So that's just sort of what the music sounds like and looks like for the opening of this piece. Of course, to play a little bit of the second example, we're seeing. So, yes, the music looks no different than normal piano music. It looks just as complicated, but again, what's really, really ingenious is that it fits quite well for the left hand alone. Now, I'm not saying it's easy by any means. This is certainly not an easy piece, but the way that it's constructed, Schulhoff, you can't help but think that Schulhoff really was a great pianist. We have a few recordings of him playing the piano, which are really, really nice insights into who he was and how he played. But they're very small snippets. In this type of piece, you can tell that he really had absolute mastery of the instrument and how to construct things for the hands. Because, again, one thing that's interesting about some composers is that they write music. There's two different types of composers. Some write music sort of unrelated to the instrument that they're composing for. In other words, they'll write the music and not necessarily care about how it feels on the instrument or how it fits the hand or whatever. So some composers really feel uncomfortable because they probably never even played it on the piano ever. But in music like this, you can tell that Schulhoff wrote this music for himself to play, and he wrote it for people to sort of be able to, in some ways, enjoy playing. So, I mean, maybe it's a little bit simplistic, but it is nice as a performer sometimes to play music like this, where you really feel, despite its difficulty, that it really does fit the hand, and it's possible, and it's not something that's badly constructed, despite sounding beautiful. So, again, I have many superlatives for this piece, so I'll keep on sharing more. But yeah, this and again, what's really interesting about this piece is that again, some composers that write for the left hand, they might limit themselves to very small spatial movements. But in this piece, Schulhoff is having us play. I mean, I'm basically playing the entire expanse of the keyboard. Which I'll get to in later movements as well. But yes, I would say that this wonderful piece, this first movement, it's just exploring harmony and color in the most beautiful way. Not to mention, one of my favorite moments is the ending of this piece, which many people probably think I'm playing a wrong note, perhaps. Which, again, we're in this wonderful D minor. And then we expect, because we're in this wonderful. But actually, instead of giving us a D in the very end, he gives us an F, which. Certainly, we have that's a question mark, and he even writes that note. He writes that note sort of quasi, really soft and wispy, and he wants the note to almost barely sound. That's the marking that he writes for that last note. He writes quadruple pianissimo, which it means as soft as humanly possible. He almost wants the sound to kind of come from nowhere and just rub slightly against that top A in a wonderful way, so that we're left again with a question. But he moves on to the second movement in air. And in this air, we see just again this wonderfully contemplative mood that he's creating, and again, the air is a form of music that was particularly inspired by Bach and earlier composers in the Baroque era. One of the most famous airs of all time, which I'll actually play a little bit for you just for fun. I'll incorporate my right hand for this one. It is by Bach, and I'm sure many of you have heard it, but this air has a similar type atmosphere to Schulhoff, so I can't help but wonder, Schulhoff is obviously a man who studied composition, so I can't help but wonder if he, in some ways, knew about this piece. And so on. So this is the very famous work by Johann Sebastian Bach, the air, nicknamed air on the G string. G string meaning a particular string of the violin, a string that sounds as a G note when you play it. The idea is that actually this nickname came from much later on in the 1800s when a composer transcribed this for strings and was able to actually have the entire piece played on one string, the G string. So, but Bach could care less about that. Regardless, I just wanted to show you the opening of one of the most famous airs of all time. And yes, air is spelled A-I-R, just like air all around us. And for Schulhoff, a similar type of mood is entered into. Certainly, we're in a little bit more of a minor key. Circling around the note D, which is similar to the first movement. But a piece that's of great interest to me is certainly the third movement, the Zingara, the Hungarian piece. So basically, Schulhoff was a composer who was really aware of his times and his surroundings and his fellow colleagues. And again, Bartók, Bela Bartók, one of the most famous probably the most famous Hungarian composer of all time, was alive, and they were friends. It's really funny to think about concerts that had both Bartók's music, Schulhoff's music, Alban Berg's music, Anton Webern's music, all of these really famous composers that, they were sharing concerts, kind of like how many of us did as kids, where you have a group concert where every kid plays a piece. Well, I mean, back in this time, they also had group composer concerts where each composer had their composition played. So certainly they weren't kids when this was happening, but there's one kind of infamous example of a concert with Webern, Berg, Bartók, Schulhoff, and by all accounts, it did not go very well because it was performed actually in, by all reports, a rather rustic town where people enjoyed more jazz, folk music, and easy listening music. And to say the least, all four of these composers were premiering works that were a bit experimental, I would say. And apparently they didn't receive great feedback from the audience, and I think Bartók, Schulhoff kind of ran out of the concert hall right at the end of the concert because they weren't embarrassed for how the performance went, but they were a little bit perhaps shy about meeting people that weren't exactly getting what they expected. I would say that, to give you some perspective, people might have been expecting something more along the lines of the third movement in this concert. They were expecting more of a, something a bit more rhythmic and just, kind of with great fun. But in this concert, they got more of the fourth movement, which is. Something very. This is a bit more forward, modernistic type language, musically speaking. So this concert is always kind of amusing to think about for me. But certainly all these pieces that were performed, whether it was the 32 variations of Schulhoff Orchestra, the Concerto for Orchestra by Bartók, or Webern's variations, these are all masterpieces, widely regarded as masterpieces today. But I can understand that people aren't always in the mood necessarily for music that makes you not know where a melody is, where a harmony is, or you don't feel centered. So, but yeah, so this third movement though is what Hungarian people would have. This is the type of music that he would have heard in Hungary. This is the type of music that Bartók kept on with nationalistic pride. Bartók kept on writing. So I think that here Schulhoff is being inspired by his colleague Bartók, his travels, and he's trying to imbue this third movement with many different attributes of Gypsy Hungarian style music. And the first, most important one is obviously rhythm. I mean, we have these wonderful, all these offbeats, which is very, very indicative of Hungarian music. Oftentimes you'll have someone that's just, their part is just, da, da, da. They're just playing these sort of offbeat accentuations to give the music some push. But in this piece, I find it really fantastic because with one hand, Schulhoff is basically creating almost a small little Hungarian orchestra. I'll give you an example. Let's take a look at the score. So, this is the second page of the score, and we see many different types of music here. We see the music that starts so that's in the first 4 bars. We see this more of a mellow type instrument, perhaps some kind of low wind instrument or a low string. But then we start seeing all kinds of jumping and different flutes coming into play. We see bass drums coming into play. I think that basically whenever, here's an example. So coming up on the 5th bar of this page, we see all of these jumps to and fro across the keyboard, up and down. We see all these things. So this is him trying to, with one hand, have many musicians play at once. They're all kind of commenting on each other. They're all sort of jamming together. And then explicitly coming up in bar 26 and 27, 28, we see a really prime example, I think, of a drum, or at least a strumming effect of an instrument. We see these low notes. Then right here. So these would have been instruments that Hungarian, in a sense, that would have just played kind of loud drones, accentuations. I think Schulhoff's trying to emulate these great bass instruments and bass drums with his writing throughout this movement. And what's really important to note is that Hungarian music oftentimes employs an interval called the fifth, which sounds like. That's because a lot of times on these string instruments, if you play two strings together, you're going to get a fifth or an inverted fourth. But regardless, you'll get a fifth when you play two strings on a violin together. And a lot of times, that's what they would do to create sort of a background. They would just do this. So he's basically taking how Hungarian music was constructed and putting that into the piano with all these fifths, all these different, all throughout. So, and certainly the piece ends with sort of a drum. That last note, it's so low, it's a low A, but it almost just sounds like a boom. And I find it to be a very, very fun piece to play. But moving on to the next movement, the improvisation. And this movement is really, really special in the sense that throughout, for me, it always feels like we're entering outer space. He creates that so wonderfully with harmonies. So the harmonic language that he's using here is much more modernistic and experimental than what we've been hearing perhaps before. And this piece is really, an improvisation where Schulhoff is just trying to kind of wander around. He's actually centering around a few notes, which honestly, I can't tell when I first listen to it. I mean, you have to study the piece to really figure out what he's constructing. But there is a thought and an architecture behind this piece. So even though it's an improvisation, he still is incorporating elements that are building blocks, I guess. But one interesting thing is that at the end of this piece, he does write a sort of, again, a Hungarian type or folk type melody in this movement, where he basically has a very strict rhythm. So this is more out of the third movement, where he's having a little snippet of that before, and then we enter this kind of exotic world once again. But he's really incorporating many elements into this movement, little pieces, little cells. And I always find that it's best to listen to this movement just kind of with an open mind and letting the music, it's kind of like floating in water. You just see where the current sort of takes you. And certainly there is a current, as in the middle of the piece we go into this very fast passage work for the left hand. But the finale, again, molto maestoso, allegro. This piece, this movement reminds me of, again, a very important aspect of Schulhoff's life, that in addition to being a composer and a fantastic artist, musician, he was a soldier in World War I, and he was a POW. He was wounded in the war. He suffered certainly some traumatic experiences, but and that was in World War I, so 1918, around that time period, 1917. And this piece would have written in 1926, so 10 years later. So again, what's interesting is that we oftentimes associate wartime music with the Russian composer Shostakovich or Prokofiev, two composers that were Russian that oftentimes would write music that was very militaristic. Whether it's Prokofiev's, music that has a really strong pulse that can build in its energy and its psychotic energy at times. And I think that here we definitely see Schulhoff in a similar vein, where we know that Shostakovich admired Schulhoff. We know, I don't know about Prokofiev necessarily, but Shostakovich was a composer that, yes, thought very highly of Schulhoff. And in this piece, in this particular one, we definitely, I hear, glimpses, I start hearing parts of Shostakovich symphonies that are very, these are almost like these military marches that with really sinister energy. But we have to remember, though, again, Schulhoff was writing a lot of his music before Shostakovich was. So this piece would have come before the Seventh Symphony, the Fifth Symphony that I imagine sometimes this being associated with. So throughout this last movement, Schulhoff is constantly dealing with creating interesting rhythms. So what's really interesting about this piece is that technically it's technically in 4/4, which is a very common time signature. 1, 2, 3, 4. But he wants us to divide that into a very specific way. For him, instead of just keeping it very straight, he wants to divide it into these interesting groups of 3 plus 2 plus 3. 3 plus 2 plus 3 equals 8. And we get this interesting type of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1. We get this very uneasiness, I would say. So, in doing this, Schulhoff is imbuing his music with an even more frenetic and agitated type energy. So I find the Marchi molto maestoso to be psychologically interesting, because as I'm trying to keep this piece under wraps and I'm trying to control it, it really feels like it's boiling out of control with these rhythms that are 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Particularly the fact that we have 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. That 1, 2 is basically you're cutting short what we expect. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We're expecting this, but that 1, 2 makes us jerk a little bit more to the side as we're playing. And again, it just feels like you never quite. It's like you're holding on to your pet dog, and he's trying to run away from you all the time. And I think that's kind of what Schulhoff's trying to create here is a piece that feels like it's about to fly off the reins, so to speak. But again, we don't necessarily know throughout this work where we're going in terms of toward a kind of a happy spot, not a happy spot, but toward maybe more of a fun area where we don't know if it's going to be more jovial, but certainly it's not as we enter. And then the very ending of this piece ends very abruptly, where we have a rather dry and as Schulhoff writes it, with all your power. We have these last 2 bars, and with a very percussive and defiant nature, we end the piece with just a low B flats. So I guess what I've been trying to do today is just put a magnifying glass on Schulhoff's left-hand suite, number 3, to show you guys how great this piece is and how neglected it really is. Sorry about that. So again, the left-hand suite by Erwin Schulhoff is one of my all-time favorite works by this great composer. And again, in addition to writing music that is jazzy, dance-like, Schulhoff also would write music like this of a bit more serious nature, a bit more of a harkening back to the older forms of music, older styles, similar to where again he's drawing upon in some ways ghostly remnants of Bach's suites. So I certainly look forward to sharing more of Schulhoff's music with you in the future, in future live streams. But again, today I really enjoyed really dissecting this particular piece. And actually, I should note one thing I should have mentioned is that this piece was written for a pianist who didn't lose his right arm, but his right arm was impaired after World War I. So many pianists around that time of World War I, World War II were asking composers to write music for the left hand alone or one hand alone because unfortunately they were being wounded or worse. And Ravel, Schulhoff, Korngold, other composers would write music for the left hand alone. This particular gentleman's name was Octavar Hulleman, who this suite was written for. So this pianist, by all accounts, performed the piece several times. But certainly, I think that it's truly special for us to be able to have such an ingeniously written composition for the left hand alone. And with that, I'd like to thank Cindy and Alex of InPulse Creatives for hosting the Close Encounters series and giving us artists like myself and my colleagues a platform to really share some of our insights and just some of the things I'm really excited about, honestly. I'm really excited about everything I'm talking about today. I just really enjoy sharing that with you in this really intimate setting. So I'm looking forward to my next live stream later this month and sharing more of the music that I love. So thank you again for joining me and have a good day wherever you might be. Bye-bye.